Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Everybody really sad today? So sad, it's our last lecture today. You must be really sad. Yes, I'm really sad too, as you can see. So the class is barreling to a close. We're not going to spend time talking about your final exam today. The slides are already posted. The keywords are, the guide, the study guide is already posted. The exam will run exactly like your midterm ran, so one slide comparison, and then however I arrange the rest, I don't remember, but it will run the exact same way. The one thing I would ask you to do is make sure when you look at the keywords that you look at that study guide, because this half of the term I have added 2 new keywords to the class. So just to make sure that you have them in your, you're not looking on your syllabus, that you look on that. One of them we're going to talk about today, but the other one I think we did a couple weeks ago. So just to remember that you look at that document for those keywords rather than your syllabus. Any questions for me about that? All right, then we're going to spend today talking about our last subject, the consumer, which seems like an oldie but a goodie because we've been talking about consumerism a lot in this course already. So I think that that'll be interesting to see how it plays out for you guys today. Excuse me, and to do that though, we need to begin with the historical context coming out of World War II. Last class we spoke about surrealism and the lead up to World War II. Now we're going to kind of start with the aftermath because we're really going to talk about, in today's class, a historical period right after World War II, which might be termed high modernism. But we're going to then quickly shift that towards postmodernism as we move through the lecture. And so I'm showing you here 2 images of the devastation caused by World War II. We see on the left London from 1944, Berlin on the right from 1945, just to kind of provide some visual context to thinking about World War II. I'm assuming, I used to assume that my students had a lot of knowledge of global history, and so that you would understand when I said World War II exactly what it meant. Now I think I'm getting so old that I can't rely on that anymore, so I'm just going to go through it as if we don't know too much about it. But I would say that if you don't know a lot about World War II, you might want to spend a little bit of time online looking at some images just to get a sense of it, because it is a kind of global conflict that is still, the legacy of which we still are dealing with in some ways today. When we talk about World War II and the horrors of World War II, we're talking about a time period with about 50 million deaths worldwide or globally. A conflict that virtually every part of the world was involved in between 1939 and 1945. We had the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, versus the Allied powers, France, Great Britain, the US, the USSR, and to a lesser extent, China. In many ways, we can think about World War II as a continuation of World War I, or a continuation of some of the unresolved conflicts of that war, but also some of the economic and political implications after that war. In particular, we can think of, say, for instance, Germany coming out of World War I. A lot of reparations or monetary penalties were placed on Germany, which ensured that its economy couldn't recover. So it was no doubt that Germany needed to move towards World War II because really it seemed to have no options politically, where poverty and access to things like food were just so scarce. It was a very problematic period. So we're going to think about that, but there's a couple things that make World War II different, and I just want to pull that forward as a way to discuss or kind of get us into the headspace of talking about this period. And when I say that, I had all these slides that I was going to put in the lecture that I pulled yesterday right before I posted the lecture, because I realized that I wasn't quite prepared to talk about it. It made me realize that World War II, the legacy of World War II, is still something that we deal with today in so many ways. And there's 2 particular events from World War II or issues from World War II that I want to bring forward. The first is the Holocaust. And because I think, and originally I had some images in here of the liberation of the concentration camps, and then I just realized I don't want to look at it because it's so hard for me to look at that material and talk about it. And then I thought, I was trying to weigh that against how many of you have ever actually seen images of the liberation of the concentration camps. And if you haven't, you should, because although they're hard to look at, they're important to understanding global history, right? So if you haven't done that, please do that. But I'm going to let you do that on your own. I'm just going to make sure we understand what it was as a phenomenon. We're talking about 9 million deaths perpetuated by Nazi Germany, 6 million of which were about ethnic genocide. 6 million Jewish people killed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. Programmatic and a complete genocide. And then also 3 million others exterminated. Those could include ethnic Poles, Romani, as well as Soviet POWs, anyone with a political or religious dissent, also people with different kinds of difference that were evident. So whether that difference is in terms of one's physical or mental capabilities. We talked about degenerate art a couple classes ago, in the way in which the Nazis used comparisons to the mentally ill or other kinds of factions of society to talk about depravity or problems in relation to culture. All of those people were just exterminated from Germany and from occupied countries, as well as sexual difference. That wasn't tolerated in Nazi Germany either. So as Germany expanded its land mass and began to occupy other countries, it began to take that process of genocide with it. And when we think about the implications of that, an kind of ethnic extermination through things like starvation, forced confinement, labor camps, gas chambers, etc., the willful murder of a whole ethnic group, we're still dealing with the consequences of that today. And just to be clear, during the period of the Nazi rise to power, over 95% of the Jewish population in Germany was exterminated or relocated, most of which were exterminated. 25% of the Jewish population in France was exterminated. 90% of the Jewish population in Poland, exterminated. So we're talking massive amounts of people. Again, 9 million people, but it's the implications of that as well, the legacy of that. How do you make sense of and live with the broad scale of man's inhumanity to humankind, or humankind's inhumanity to humankind? But how do you live with that? And it's not, the Holocaust was not the first or the last case of genocide, unfortunately, but it was such a massively programmatic and calculated practice that its implications are still kind of hard to wrap our heads around. And in all sorts of ways. The second really important thing to think about in relation to World War II is the dropping of the atomic bombs. And it's, we have the first city to be hit by a bomb, August 6, 1945, Hiroshima in Japan, killed on impact between 70 and 80,000 people. That doesn't even kind of deal with the people who then had these lasting implications of radiation poisoning, or still legacies of birth defects and infertility that are passed on to other generations. So the implications of again, that mankind or humankind's inhumanity to humankind, the guilt of that, kind of try to make sense of that, is still something that we deal with today. And I don't think that we can talk about World War II context, that post-World War II context, without thinking about that trauma and what that might mean. So I'll leave it at that, but I just wanted to keep those two historical kind of game changers in relation to World War in mind, because it's going to come up again and again as we move through some of these slides. And first place it's going to come up is in relation to how culture deals with that. In today's class, we're going to talk largely about US-based production. We're going to talk about a group of artists in New York called the Abstract Expressionists. Then we're going to move to a contemporary design team, modern design team, Charles and Ray Eames. And then we're going to just end our lecture talking about pop art. We're going to kind of flip through it rather fast in some ways, but we're in the practice of doing that. We're going to talk about kind of what is that post-World War II moment about? And then how does that pave the way for what are still very contemporary notions of consumer culture and corporate capitalism? So we're going to kind of move through that space. But to do that, I'm showing you an image a photograph taken in a statement that was published in relation to it. In 1951, printed in Life magazine, called the Irascibles. What does irascible mean? Anybody know? Beautiful dictionary definition. One who is easily angered. So somebody who's easily angered. And that's who these people, or these signatures of a petition, and then these people in the photograph are people who are easily angered. And they're very much connected to the avant-garde. So maybe you've heard of people like Jackson Pollock before, who's pictured here, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, William de Kooning, as well as many others. How many of you have ever heard of this artist here, the only female among the group? How many of you know of Hedda Stern? Show of hands? A couple. Why? Because female artist, man, right? Really hard, even in this moment, to kind of have a kind of legacy going forward. Very popular today, kind of largely forgotten about in contemporary world. So we're going to look at what were they angered about. Well, these artists in 1951, coming out of that post-World War II context, were particularly angry about a show put on by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Metropolitan Museum of Art announced a big program that they were going to expand their contemporary art collection. When they began to do that, they included no North American artists within that stable. They only expanded their collection in relation to European modernism, so European contemporary artists. These artists felt that was particularly problematic, and that these museum curators, directors involved in these decisions were missing the fact that advanced avant-garde production was now happening in New York. So let's think about that. And maybe to think about it, we'll start with the work of this figure here, Mark Rothko, one of his paintings. This is his Orange and Yellow from 1956. And really what we're trying to get at here is what that context was like, what it meant to be producing high, fine art, whatever we want to call it, in those years right after World War II. And to be clear, you know, these artists that we're going to discuss, all of which are loosely organized around the phrase abstract expressionism, were very much influenced by European modernism. In fact, just like with World War I, during World War II, a lot of artists, designers, advanced practitioners of culture in Europe escaped Europe to come to the US or to other nations. But a real massing in the US, particularly because very little of the war was fought on US territory. Now, bringing with them that group of artists, they brought ideas, right? So ideas, we have people in New York, like André Breton at this time, who's talking about surrealism and ideas of the unconscious. We have artists like Mondrian in New York at the time, talking about abstraction. So really when we discuss these New York-based artists who are kind of coming out of that moment, they're very much tied to a legacy of European modernism that we've been discussing for the last 3 or 4 weeks. So just to kind of keep that in mind. But at the same time, I do want to be clear that they thought their art had to matter, and it had to matter quite significantly to that moment. Here I'm going to read you a quote by the artist Barnett Newman. Barnett Newman was one of these figures, someone I've worked a lot on myself in my own scholarship, though I'm not going to talk about him today. But in 1967, he argued the following. So 20 years after that period, he said, "You must realize that 20 years ago we felt the moral crisis of a world in shambles, a world devastated by a Great Depression and a fierce world war. And it was impossible at that time to paint the kind of paintings we were doing, flowers, reclining nudes, people playing cello. At the same time, we could not move into a situation of a pure world of unorganized shapes and forms, or color. And I would say that for some of us, this was our moral crisis, what to paint. So that we actually began, so to speak, from scratch, as if painting were not only dead, but had never existed," unquote. Now there's lots of hyperbole in that statement, let's just be clear, and a lot of kind of making it up as he goes along. But the idea is that how can you just paint what you've seen after looking at these photographs of the liberation of the concentration camps, after realizing that you're part of a culture, particularly in the North America, that dropped the bomb, you know, and killed such massive amounts of people, the implications of which again are still being dealt with. How do you begin to produce culture in relation to that period? How do you begin to think about the purpose of art? And as we move forward, and we're going to just talk about a couple of these artists very quickly to kind of get us into our subject matter, but do be clear that these artists, like many of the artists that we talked about in relation to the Utopia lecture, were trying to figure out how their art could produce change, how it could signal some sort of difference in a world with all sorts of anxieties, questions about behavior and ethics. How can the work make a difference? And so we're going to think about that as we move through these first couple images as a way to kind of situate ourselves. But let's just make sure we all know what I mean by the term abstract expressionism. And this canvas is slightly bigger than what an what it is in real life. But in general, I'm going to make some claims about abstract expressionism that are, just kind of a placeholder for us to think about it as a term. So when I say that term, I'm talking about a group of diverse artists working in and around New York City who were interested in abstraction in the post-war years. Very influenced by surrealism, so an interest in the unconscious and what that holds. Very concerned with the possibilities of an art for art's sake that we've discussed before, an art that's purely about art, aesthetic values, but whose work also, they believed, could lead to some kind of spiritual reconciliation, some kind of transcendence over the difficulties of that political moment. So real interested in kind of how that can play out. In general, this work is very large scale. Again, this is still kind of easel painting size here, but most of the work is almost mural size, very large. The work, and there's a reason for that, right? That large canvas creates a visual field that absorbs the viewer, right? Think about it. If you see a painting that's this big, it's very different seeing a painting this big versus that big, right? When you see a painting that's that big or larger, billboard size, it creates a whole visual field for you in a different kind of way. So this painting in general, very large scale, often creates this kind of environment for the viewer. It tends to prioritize an all-over composition, so the entire composition is treated rather similarly. Tends to be completely abstract, no referential content. And also there tends to be very little depth, a real flatness to the composition. So we talked about that all the way back when we started to discuss Manet and Olympia in the mid-19th century. The way in which the picture plane, that illusionistic depth of a canvas, gets flattened out. So here you're not looking at some kind of illusion of a three-dimensional space. It's just a flat surface. Although Rothko is a bad example, because if we were standing in front of this painting and really focused on it and looked at it for a long period of time, it almost appears like those geometric shapes hover or pulsate slightly. It's sort of an optical effect caused by his painting, so it's sort of a bad example for that, but I'm just going with it. Okay, let's talk about Rothko for a second. He immigrated to the U.S. right before World War I from Russia, and grew up in the States. Believed in art as a language to express the spiritual. He argued in an interview in 1957 that, quote, "I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom. And if you're moved only by color relationships, you miss the point," unquote. So just like with the utopian framed abstraction of the World War I era, we see these artists investing in this painting a lot of meaning, right? This is about tragedy, ecstasy, doom, base human emotions. It's not about the color combination necessarily, right? It's not about that. It's about something more deep and lasting. Now, and we can think about it in relation to Rothko here. We can think about it in relation to maybe an artist you know a little bit better, Jackson Pollock, another mid-20th century painter associated with abstract expressionism. This painting is about 50% bigger than what you're looking at here, so just to kind of give you a sense of scale. Again, that overarching large scale of the canvas. But even for Jackson Pollock, painting was about more than just its formal composition, right? So yes, this is a painting made up of paint flung at the canvas, right? An artist who's just pouring and flinging paint as he walks around it on unprimed canvas on the floor. He then later stretches that canvas, tacks it up on a wall. But as we look at it here, for Pollock, it was similarly important, connected to a broader content than what its abstract qualities might call up. For Pollock, who was a very politically leaning artist, was associated with all sorts of art workers groups and labor unions in the 1930s, was highly influenced from that period onwards, so from the late 1930s onwards, by psychoanalysis, and particularly Jungian psychoanalysis. Last class we talked about the work of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan. Here I'll introduce another figure, Carl Jung. I'll spell his last name for you, J-U-N-G, who was a Swiss psychiatrist and a founder of analytical psychology. And there were two ideas that were really important to Pollock there and why he began to explore that. Many of the artists of the day were exploring the unconscious. The unconscious is a site of possibilities. And Jung argued there was a couple things about the unconscious that were interesting. One is it's collective. We have a collective unconscious. That idea is that there's a small part of everyone's brain that connects, that is the same as everyone else's brain in the world. And that collective, that small shared bit of collective unconscious, if explored and thought about, emphasized, might create a kind of understanding, shared understanding. Think about why that might be interesting in a world that's still coming to terms with the implications of the tragedy of World War II. The second thing that Jung was very interested in, he believed in exploring the psyche through dreams, through art, through mythology, religion. And he was interested in ideas of archetypes, psychological archetypes. That particular idea is that there's a set amount of psychic dispositions. So if we can locate and make sense of all of those different dispositions, then we can better begin to understand difference. Why I might be the way I am and you might be the way you are, and how we might begin to build common understanding. Again, this interest in the unconscious and in building relationships through a kind of shared psychoanalytic practice was one way in which to deal with the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, again, to understand humankind's brutality to humankind. And so Pollock was really interested in that, so he saw these paintings as a kind of mediation on the unconscious. He actually practiced his very technique of painting with flipping paint at the canvas should remind you of automatism from surrealism last class. This idea that you just paint and don't even know what you're doing, right? That you're just flinging paint at a canvas. Again, think about this process that he engages in here. Now, I won't say that just because Newman, Rothko, Pollock argued that their work could change the world and that this work could really help us understand the psychology of that post-World War II moment. Just because they argued that doesn't mean that's how the work got interpreted. And I just want to be clear that, remember in our very first class together, we talked about the relationship that's established between an artist, an object, and a viewer. And we talked about the instability of that relationship. You know, an artist might definitely feel they have this one thing to share with the world, but that doesn't mean anybody reads that. We can add to that relationship critics. So critics of this work largely talked about it as first formal. Right? What are the formal relationships? How can we talk about the composition, its constituent parts? Other critics used it as a way in which to talk about things like a heroism enacted in painting. You know, in other words, in particular, I'm talking about one critic here, Howard Rosenberg, who in 1957 wrote an article called The American Action Painters, in which he said this kind of painting where you're walking around your canvas, where you're taking charge, when you're flinging paint, this kind of painting is very heroic. It's the legacy of American art. It's like the pioneer, the cowboy, and he really used those terms. And in that process, he defined a kind of contemporary avant-garde artist as very take charge, very masculine even, and very much connected to charting the way forward at a very difficult socio-political moment. And so that connection here is really important to think about. That just because an artist wants their work to be read this way doesn't mean the work gets read that way. We can think about the last, in relation to the last abstract expressionist painter I want to show you, Helen Frankenthaler. So maybe Frankenthaler fared a little bit better in that you've heard of her, but you've only really heard of her because of scholars in the 1970s who went back and really began to look at those early paintings that she produced and what they might have meant. Unlike Pollock, she doesn't fling her paint at a canvas. Instead, she pours it on the canvas or uses techniques where she thins the pigment out and she puts it on the canvas, sometimes with brushes, sometimes with sticks, and sometimes literally poured. And to do that, she doesn't necessarily use an easel all the time. Some of her work she does, but sometimes she literally puts the canvas down and sometimes moves the canvas to control those pourings of paint on top of it. In fact, Maurice Lewis very famously later steals that technique and becomes the one really famous for it. But let's just for a moment look at this. So here's one of her paintings, and she similarly talked about it as connected to the spiritual. But for a moment, let's just look at a difference in photographs taken of the artist in their studio. So the image that I've already shown you of Pollock on the right is from Life magazine, and it's printed in 1950, along with an article that's, 1951, along with an article that's headed, the title reads, "Is Pollock the Greatest Living Painter?" So really this investment in Pollock and in that process is kind of charting the way forward for contemporary modernist painting. Where we juxtapose that with a photograph that gets put in Life magazine in 1957 of Frankenthaler. Here we see the artist in her studio, seated on her canvas. Let's think about some stylistic or some descriptive differences between these two. Pollock appears active, engaged, in command as he moves around the canvas. Frankenthaler seems passive, even kind of flirtatious maybe with the photographer, right? She's very much a subject of the lens in that way. Where Pollock appears a very virile, Frankenthaler appears quite soft, right? It almost looks like a painting. The color is so, she's absorbed by those paintings through the color that she even wears. Let's not forget that abstract expressionism in that post-World War II moment is just as patriarchal and gender divided as most of the work that we've looked at through this entire class. And while there may be more opportunities for female artists in the 1950s, that doesn't mean that it was smooth sailing or easygoing. So I just kind of wanted to keep that in mind as we kind of move forward. Now I've used Frankenthaler, Pollock, Newman, and Rothko as a way to kind of contextualize how do we produce art in the aftermath of World War II? How can we begin to come back to representation as a strategy? And I'm going to leave that here and I'm going to pick that up at the end again, because now I want to kind of move towards design practices happening at the same time. And to do that, we're going to actually start with context again. And we're going to look at, here's a slide of Levittown. Ever hear of a suburb? One of the first suburbs in North America represented here. Levittown was built between late 1947, 1948, and opened in 49. And Levittown was one of a series of subdivisions produced by Levitt and Sons, a company, a series of 4 subdivisions in the United States, but which were very much about consumerism and the development of consumerism in the post-World War II era. So we'll think about that as we move forward. But just so you're clear, you're looking at an aerial view of that suburb. Now, so far we talked about the psychological impact of World War II and kind of coming out of that moment. Here I'm going to talk about some other kind of impacts of that particular moment. And first of all, I want to think about the US coming out of World War II, North America more generally, but the US specifically. And particularly the way in which it emerges from the war, technologically and economically on top. So as veterans return to the United States after the war, there's a real interest in pushing home ownership, consumer culture, and in even a notion of what might be termed a quote-unquote American dream. And that term still kind of exists today, the American dream. It's a very specific term that responds to a set of ideals in which freedom is thought to include opportunities for prosperity and success that has little to do with one's social class. So in other words, the American dream is this idea of freedom in which there's tons of opportunity for prosperity and success, in which that success is regardless of one's social class. So anybody has the opportunity to succeed within the rhetoric of the American dream, right? Anybody has the potential for growth, for development, for prosperity. Now, we're going to come back to the notion of the American dream as we move through this, but this Levittown is very much part of that, right? So we have all these people coming back from the war effort, and the government works to make homes like this affordable, right? So all of a sudden, individuals can afford to buy their own home, so it prioritizes private home ownership as part of that American dream. To make it happen, the government does all sorts of special loans available to veterans, or those returning forces. At the same time, the development of the suburb has the same issues and questions around it that we talked about all the way back in Paris, the urbanization of Paris in the mid-19th century. Right? Once you have a suburb, well, first of all, look where it's situated, among fields, farm fields, right? So this development happens not in urban centers, but pushed to the periphery. What do you need in relation to that then? You need an automobile. So it promotes car culture, because you need to get from where you live to where you work. It also produces it promotes the development of the highway system. Most major highways in the United States were built between 1930 and 1970. That's where the basic, and most of it built after 1945. So just to kind of keep in mind this kind of expansion of consumerism connects to things like the suburb, car culture. Now we have these homes, and here I'm showing you a kit, or basically a set of parts to build a home. This is one of those plats or homes in Levittown as it's being built. Those homes need new products in them, right? So all of a sudden we're developing consumer culture more widely. And we have it everything down to from staircases, all prefabricated, to different kinds of supports and structures, to everything including that white picket fence, which is the kind of symbol of that American dream, right? Your individual home ownership with 2 kids, a car in the garage, and the white picket fence, this kind of metaphor for that. But I do want to complicate that a little bit further, and I want to complicate it in 2 ways. And that first I want to do it in relation to notions of war. So although World War II, or kind of what we would call a hot war, a real war with actual combat, had stopped in 1945, it initiated another kind of war. And that's what you might have heard of as the Cold War. So coming right out of World War II, we have the establishment of the Cold War, which is basically a state of tension, or kind of ideological tension between 2 entities that stops short of actual war, but which can often result in real tensions, political differences, and propaganda. In the years after World War II, that Cold War condition became established between democratic countries or democracies led by the US and communist or Eastern Bloc countries led by the USSR. Now, there were moments when it looked like those Cold War tensions might result in real war. We can think about what's called the Berlin Airlift, when Russian forces blockaded West Berlin and didn't allow any access to it. We can think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, a close call for nuclear war in 1962, where JFK later describes having his hand literally on the red button for more atomic war. So it's like these moments of ideological fracture did kind of explode, right? There were very difficult political moments in relation to it. But I'm more concerned today here with its political and propagandistic effects. And so in a sense, this belief in the American dream, this belief in kind of suburbia and this private home ownership very much connects to a broader sense of that Cold War tension, where if in Soviet Russia, we have, every worker kind of becomes the proletariat the same, in the US you have this, the idea is, or the kind of rhetoric is, that you have an opportunity to better yourself and to kind of prioritize some sort of gain. So when we think about Levittown, I'm going to come back. I said there's two things. So one coming out of that tension is the Cold War. The other thing I want to talk about is the Marshall Plan. I'll do that in 1 second. But just to be clear here about the importance of Levittown, this notion of assembly line production and home manufacture, of homes built quickly and cheaply, came in a standard kit of parts that were then assembled on site. That this was very, very popular. And so the first Levittown, I think I said there was 4, opened in March of 1949. Within 3 hours of them opening the sales for these homes, the 1,400 homes in this development were sold. 3 hours. So this notion of a kind of popularity, this of a rise of suburbia and this kind of commitment to car culture is something that's very much locked into Levittown itself. But again, those homes need products, right? It's not just about consumerism in relation to the building of these homes and the cars that will take us to these homes. It's what's inside these homes. And here I want to bring us back to that second issue that's a kind of condition of post-World War II culture that influences cultural production quite a lot, both in relation to high art and design. And that is the Marshall Plan. And so the Marshall Plan is an economic recovery program initiated by a senator from the US named Marshall, that's where the name comes from, but which between 1947 and 1952 helped Europe recover from the war. So an economic recovery program. During that time, the United States sent $13 billion, so a 5-year period, $13 billion to 17 countries. And in part, it demonstrates that the US did emerge financially on top after the war and could help those nations that were devastated by war being fought on their soil rebuild that infrastructure. And coming from the US myself, I could almost feel this was an altruistic project on the part of the US, except I know what went with it. And that is the US said, here, we'll give you all this money if you take in return our trade. So in other words, you open your doors to our consumer products. It's only after World War II that Coca-Cola becomes an international product. Right? It's only after World War II that you can buy consumer goods made in the United States throughout Europe. So it's not just about producing these dishwashers for Levittown, it's about producing all sorts of consumer goods which now speak of a place, the United States or North America, that's all about that dream of prosperity, that dream of consumerism and everything that will buy us. And just because this is such a great advertisement, the American Kitchen's Roto-Tray dishwasher, just look at everything. So, just think about the messages it tells us. First of all, it tells us how easy it is to use and what it costs. But then another woman in the image, she appears, she doesn't have to do any work. She's leaving the kitchen on her way outside. Or my favorite part of the image are all these faces, these hopeful faces of how this is going to, all women, right? How this is going to transform our daily life. I could spend speak about I could teach a whole course on the history of Levittown and the ways in which the rise of suburbia also repositioned women in relation to domesticity after women had been serving in the workforce all through those years of World War II, right? So what are the gender implications of that? I remember when I finished my doctorate, my aunt, who actually recently died, but my aunt, who was quite a character, gave me a book, a first edition book of a cookbook, the American Woman's Cookbook from 1952. And I'm sure she did it just to give it to me because that was the nature of my aunt. As you open the cookbook, only about a quarter of the book contained recipes. The rest of the book talked about how you, as the American housewife's cookbook, how you as an American housewife should serve your food. So it was all about how you shouldn't let your man have a difficult day when he gets home from the office. You know, he's been having a really hard time of it. You should make sure those kids are fed and put to bed and that you have enough time to dress properly to then have your dinner, you know, they should never see, your partner should never, which wasn't called partner, your husband, should never see any of the dirty dishes, right? You should get that all cleaned up ahead of time so he doesn't have to see that unsightly mess. Like this book, I mean, it was a very veiled attempt on the part of my aunt to say, yeah, Trish, I'm not exactly down with your lifestyle. but it's a fascinating read because it's so much about the ideology of that moment, right? And it was, it's also a very, it was a first edition, it's a lovely book, but it's this on steroids, right? This kind of sense of how, you know, how hopeful I am, or hopeful one should be in reading it about what these new conveniences can offer women in our world. So when we think about advertising, and maybe you've all watched the TV series Mad Men, that should give you a sense of it anyway, in big business in the 1950s, we're talking about a kind of branding, marketing that's largely and connected to at least domesticity, centered around women. And as we move through the 1950s, we start to have marketing centered around teenagers. So this kind of beginning to locate markets for this expansion of consumer goods. Okay, and not only that, let's talk about television. And this is just a stat that gives you a sense of television sales both before the war or during war years and after the war, and how quickly televisions became ubiquitous after World War II. Television is an idea that came out of the 1930s. Even before that. The idea came out of the 1920s with David Sarnoff from RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, publicly speculating on the possibility of, quote, every farmhouse equipped not only with a sound receiving device, but with a screen that would mirror the sights of life, unquote. Television as a product was not really introduced into the World's Fair in New York in 1939, but because of the war, the technology invested in television quickly became part of the war effort, being used for planes and different kinds of transportation devices to promote communication. But then after the war, it gets brought back into a consumer marketplace. And just so we're all clear, television was never, we always think today of television as being about shows, right? Programming. So you can think about your favorite shows that you like to watch, or maybe favorite kinds of programming that there might exist. But television was always thought of as a mechanism for advertisement. In fact, that's all it was when it started. And the only reason programming was added was to keep you watching between commercials. That's it. So, I think that's important to think about even today, that's the point. Television is only a mechanism for advertisement. Sure, there might be some fun things in the middle, or maybe even some educational or interesting things. But don't forget, it's a mechanism for advertisement. That's all it's ever been. So it's important to kind of wrap our head around that, because we always think of it almost as a public service issue, in relation to what it can bring us. But that's not why it was devised. It was devised as connected to corporate capitalism. So here's where I want to bring us back to. Believe it or not, we've spent, 40 minutes in our lecture. I'm only getting to our first keyword. But let's talk about corporate capitalism. And as I do that, we've already talked in this class about capitalism. And I think that was actually a keyword earlier in the term. We talked about capitalism as an economic system, one in which, from a Marxist perspective or a Marxist critique, might even be based on the exploitation of labor, right? So an individual can exploit the labor of others to make capital. And we do this under systems of free enterprise. Capitalism, like any other economic system, is not good or bad in and of itself. It's just a system. It's good or bad in how it's taken up. But it does emphasize private property, and it does relate to broader class structure. But here I want to complicate it by actually talking about corporate capitalism. And the 1950s brings in, or the years after World War II, is where capitalism gets shifted a bit into an era of corporations. And if we, let's just, if you guys have never seen the movie The Corporation or read the book, you should write that down in big bold letters, maybe circle it a couple times so that you watch it. You can watch it online. It's a really good documentary about the corporation, which was produced, a book written, and then a movie documentary produced by Vancouver-based filmmaker. But just to kind of keep this term in mind, corporate capitalism is a term that's used in the social sciences and economics to describe a capitalist marketplace which is basically dominated by bureaucratic and hierarchical corporations. And just to give you a sense of scale, 50% of North American economy and 50% of the North American labor force is controlled by corporations. Now, here I want to make a distinction between, say, small business and corporations. Corporations are something that tend to be publicly traded, so they participate in a stock market. They have a massive infrastructure and hierarchy to them. They appoint executives, a top-down structure, decisions are made at the top, they kind of filter down. But these publicly traded companies that participate in the stock market tend to be highly influential to government policy. They tend to be highly influential to things like political campaigns. They tend not to act in the interest of people because their only requirement is that they create the biggest amount of accumulation of wealth for their shareholders. That's all they're supposed to do. Unlike, say, a small business, which the sole owner of that business would be liable for how that business is operated, right? So if that business does something wrong, that small business owner would be held liable for that. Unlike that, corporations have limited liability based on law. They remain less regulated and less accountable to the public than small businesses. So if we have things like environmental degradation or other kind of implications, social or political implications from corporations, there's not always the mechanisms to kind of right that through government regulation. Now, why I'm spending time talking about corporate capitalism is because the industry that produces those televisions, that produces those Levittowns, these kind of mass marketed compulsions to buy, to absorb, to collect, are very much connected to a corporate capitalist model. And so I think it's kind of important to think about whether we're talking about television or the advertisements connected to television or anything else. And I mean, just to kind of flip back for a second, I should have done that first. I mean, just look at it. Basically in a 20-year period, we go from 7,000 sets in all of the United States to 67 million, right? Like, think about that. Think about the ubiquitousness of that and what it can allow for, the power invested in that. So, I mean, I think that's really important to think about. I mean, yes, television is mindless entertainment sometimes, which we all enjoy, right? I'm not diminishing that. But it's kind of important to think about where it comes from, right? And why it's so powerful. Because it consumes the attention of so many people all the time. So that's why when my 7-year-old says, "Mom, can we get a television?" I say, "No way." So I'm going to have no little nerdy kids, that's for sure. Okay, so let's think about this now in relation to design. I know, I'm sure don't worry, I have a big therapy jar, and every time we do make a decision that I'm sure will have implications like $20 for the therapy jar. So they'll be well taken care of later in life. That's how we do it. Okay, so let's bring this into design now. So we started with World War II and a kind of sense of the urgency of cultural production to make change. And, I mean, that's all great and good, and it has implications, and we're going to come back to that at the end. But now I want to start to think about it in relation to design practices. And here I'm showing you an image of Charles and Ray Eames, probably the most famous of the design team in 20th century North American history. Husband and wife collaborative team known for their work in architecture and design, but also they made a ton of films, books, exhibition design. They also, Ray, particularly the wife, was a painter who also did some textile work. So really kind of broad application throughout the second part of the 20th century of design practices. And their motto and the model of their business was, quote, the most of the best to the greatest number of people for the least, unquote. Again, the most of the best to the greatest number of people for the least. That was their kind of motto. And they very much had an ethics of really designing for the masses, or this belief in designing for the masses. Here I'm showing just kind of a PR image that they produced in their studio. One of their friends brought a motorcycle over. They put a white background below it, brought the motorcycle on, and then sat on it as an advertisement. They were pretty masterful advertisers, both of their products, but also of their kind of the mechanisms through which their work, or they became known. Now they're interesting for a couple reasons, but first and foremost because they work with corporations. So their work was really centered around a couple things. First of all, they believed in a design process, the first to really standardize design processes, particularly through prototyping. So making models, making prototypes of something. They pioneered innovative technologies. So things like molded plywood, that we'll look at in a minute, fiberglass, resin chairs, wire mesh chairs, things of that nature. And their influence on American, particularly North American style and taste is pretty profound. We can look at Pottery Barn, Design Within Reach. You can walk through the library or the building across the street, and you can see all remnants of the Eames design aesthetic. Now, their whole idea was in really working towards finding lasting solutions to fundamental needs. So although they worked with corporations and they had this kind of broad-based practice, they really saw it as a kind of simple solution, all about these simple solutions in design to deal with kind of broader needs. But because they worked with corporations, their largest corporate client was IBM, they had the ability to get their designs out to a broad public. And that's in part what made them so famous. So it was really that connection between designers and corporations that kind of allowed for that. And I mean, they did some masterful films and slideshows, trade booths for IBM. It's really fascinating to look at just in and of itself. But you may know them more for things like this, the chair, right? The Eames chair, one of a series of Eames chair. This particular one's called the lounge chair in wood. But their work was very much looking at how technology fits together and how the body relates to it. So they're the first designers in relation to furniture design to so heavily study ergonomics and the way in which the physical body would sit in a chair. And they began to think about technologies that could help them produce, again, these mass-marketed chairs that would bring it to a wide public. And that doesn't mean that today, if you try to buy one of these chairs, they're very cheap, mind you. And never really were they, though they used to be much cheaper than they are now. But it does kind of give you a sense of that was the idea, at least, even if it never gets taken up that way. Now, here I want to bring up another one of your keywords for today's class, and that it's mid-century modern. And that term gets used a lot, mid-century modern, to kind of connote this sort of stylistic look that we're concerned with the Eames products. We can say that mid-century modern is can connect to architecture, interior design, product, graphic design, but it really speaks to a kind of design aesthetic which emerges between the mid-1930s, 1933 to 1965. And so it comes, I mean, it's very much part of that post-World War II context. It's first defined, though, or really talked about in the 80s, when a writer by the name of Kara Greenberg titles her book Mid-Century Modern Furniture of the 1950s. And that's when it kind of became codified as a term to discuss this kind of look. And so let me define the look. A mid-century modern product has a look which is marked by simple, clear lines, really reduced ornament. It has a natural form that tends to connect to the body. So ergonomics again. There's an emphasis on mass production here and what might even be called democratic design. Again, the best for the, to the most for the least, as the Eames argued for. It's highly influenced as a kind of design movement by the arts and crafts movement that we looked at before, right? This idea of how can you design well for the broadest public, though there was no compulsions about using corporations or the machine here, right? It was very much part of that. So this mid-century mid-century modern design aesthetic is very much connected to the Eames and many others. You may have heard of people like Frank Lloyd Wright, that he kind of also comes, his architecture paves the way from that movement, or maybe some Scandinavian design teams and the principles that they put forward. So while I'm only talking about it in relation to the US here, mid-century modern is really a kind of more global design practice that again simply calls up these clear lines, reduced ornament, and natural forms that often connect to the body in some way. And here's just another view of that lounge chair in wood. Now this low-seated easy chair designed by the Eames was one of the first of the chairs that they produced. And although they're known for many more products than chairs, their chairs have had a kind of a lasting influence. In fact, my partner's an architect, and so I'm part of these architectural circles of people. I feel like you can't be an architect unless you have at least one Eames chair, because they seem to be everywhere in architects' homes. We could say the same for these other famous modernist chairs, but certainly for Eames. And indeed, we have our Eames chair as well. These low-seated chairs, particularly this one here, was designed using technology that Eames produced in partnership with an architect. And Eames also had a background in architecture. And that architect was Irios Saarinen. And he and Saarinen basically worked out this technique for molding plywood to different forms. And they did this in 1940 for a MoMA, a Museum of Modern Art design competition. But what they realized is, although they had this great idea and they kind of worked up this do-it-yourself technology around it, it was very hard to get industry backing, particularly in the years of World War II, because all of that industry was being marshaled towards the war effort. So Saarinen eventually left that project and to do other things. But in the years of World War II, Charles and Ray Eames began continuing those experimentations. And in fact, in 1942, Charles Eames was asked by the US Air Force to pilot plywood forms for splints, these molded plywood forms for creating splints in order to shore up, say, a broken leg or some other kind of limb that might be damaged during the war. So he first began making these molded plywood splints, and then began that really curved and mimicked the shape of the body, the shape of the human leg. And it was that led to the development even further of the lounge chair wood that you're looking at here. So really understanding furniture is related to the body and is having to kind of be situated in relation to it. Now, despite that phrase that the Eames put forth, that phrase of, again, the most of the best, the greatest number of people for the least. I do want to bring in another key word as we look at a different chair designed by the Eames, and here we see molded plastic. And you can, a lot of these chairs were done in collaboration with a company called Herman Miller Furniture, and you can still buy these chairs through Herman Miller today. So there's still, you can buy new ones, although I'm showing you here kind of 1950s view on the bottom. These were standard fare in cafeterias. In fact, I'm pretty sure my grade school when I was a kid, had Eames-based chairs in it, although I have never gone back to check, but I'm pretty sure. Certainly the look of them at the very least. And here I want to bring up that extra keyword that I added into today's class called planned obsolescence. So the first word planned, the second word obsolescence, O-B-S-O-L-E-N-C-E. This term comes out of industrial design. In particular, it comes out of industrial design in the 1930s, and particularly Bernard London wrote an article called Ending the Depression Through Planned Obsolescence. But the phrase actually gets picked up in 1954, which is where I'm really concerned with it, popularized by an American industrial designer by the name of Brooks Stevens, who coined the phrase at an advertising conference in 1954. And I'll just read you his definition and then I'll go back and define it. But he defined planned obsolescence as the following, quote, instilling in the buyer the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than is necessary, unquote. Okay, so let's think about what that means. To own something a little newer, a little better, and a little sooner than is necessary. Planned obsolescence is really this notion, it's a policy of designing a product with a limited useful life so that it will become obsolete. That could refer to function, so it could be obsolete in function, or it could refer to style, right, that it becomes obsolete in style. But either way, the consumer is under pressure to purchase again. That's the point. Whether from the same manufacturer, a replacement, a newer model, etc., or from some competitor. We can think about this in relation to products today. How many of you have an iPhone? How many of you have an iPhone adapter? How many of you have ever changed your iPhone and now need a new adapter? You can't use that old one anymore. Why do you change your iPhone? Is it because you just want the newest, best model? Or is it because certain things become obsolete with your, or not possible with your old model? Why does Apple not continue to develop software for the old models, right? So that you can't keep upping and reworking them. Instead, you really get forced at a certain point to move to a newer model, right? And that doesn't even include the notion that I just want the newer model because it's sexier or jazzier or more interesting to me, right? How many of us buy products because of that? I mean, I'll confess, self-identify here, right? So when we talk about planned obsolescence, we're not just talking about the product failing. We're talking about a whole mechanism of operations that make us want that new thing, right? Marketing, branding, that's all part of that corporation. And it's not, or that connection to corporate capitalism. And although it sounds like I'm up here saying it's all bad and terrible, and I guess I am to some degree, I'm really just trying to make it visible, right? That's really the point. Because indeed our economy is based on buying things. And if we didn't need to buy things other than food, that would be an issue. What would we all do, right? So, well, we'd all be art historians, I guess. Because I'm pretty sure that's not very marketable in general. But I think it's interesting to think about, and even, the Eames have to confront that. Again, that idea of bringing the best to the most for the least, that gets challenged by things like planned obsolescence. It's not the designers who are thinking of that, it's the industry. It's how it becomes, certainly designers are always about thinking, and we've talked about this when we've discussed design in this course, that it is really about thinking about how to answer different kinds of needs in better ways, right? So how can we use design as a means to really, a mechanism to better respond to the world around us? And sometimes that's about making products, and sometimes that's about different ways of planning or thinking about the world. Sometimes it's not so object-based. But it is interesting to think about in connection to this idea of planned obsolescence. And certainly I don't think we can talk about things like chairs or other kinds of products without at least having that term in our mind. Now, we don't have that much time left for today's class, but I did want to spend at least a few moments talking about the Eames in relation to not just their product design, but their architecture. And this is what is called the Eames House, which was constructed and built by the Eames in 1949. It's a home and studio designed as part of what might be called what was called the Case Study House program. This was particularly Case Study House number 8. The Case Study Houses were a series of houses that were sponsored between 1945 and 1966 by Arts and Architecture magazine. So they sponsored a bunch of modern architects and designers to produce their own houses. The idea was they provided some funds, not all the funds, but some funds, and then those homes, some of which were not even built, were then documented in the magazine. And if they were built, they were documented during construction and after. If they weren't built, they were just the plans that were put into the magazine. Now, it's interesting to think about in relation to, again, that mid-century modern look, because how many of us have seen buildings that look like this? Or even in the interior, like I feel like this particular view is like every townhouse condo that I walk by on my way to the bus stop to come to work. You know, these kind of glass wall front and a tunnel in, although I'd much rather have this, but still it kind of keeps in mind that we still use these kind of spatial organizations. And in fact, the Eames were playing off people like Mondrian, right, de Style, that kind of organization, geometric organization of shapes. So still very much part of it. Here's where I want to introduce your very last keyword of today's class, although we have a bit of class left, so I don't think you're off the hook that easy. And that's postmodernism. And so, you know, we started this discussion today talking about modernism, but really what I'm trying to get to in today's class is the breakdown of modernism. And it's how it doesn't really survive so well after World War II. And so we can think about postmodernism then being a loss of faith in the modernist product. Oh, sorry, the modernist project, not product, maybe that too. We've talked about modernism in this class as kind of coming out of the Enlightenment, right? This belief in reason, rationality, logic. This belief in progress in general, a teleological or linear progress. We've also discussed modernism as sort of answering questions, providing kind of complete truths or answers for a broader public. Well, if that's modernism, then in its kind of promise to bring enlightenment or whatever else to a kind of broader world, postmodernism begins to think about its limitations. And here, to be fair, some scholars argue that postmodernism is a complete break with and rejection of modernism. Other scholars argue that postmodernism is actually a continuation of modernism, but more critically based. Either way, postmodernism challenges some of the assumptions of modernism. So, for example, it questions things like value and authenticity by asking who judges that, who determines that, who set those values. It questions things like artistic identity. You know, why is the artist usually gendered male, often white, often from a kind of patriarchal mainstream? It has no faith in absolute truths, right? There's no one answer for anything, right? We cannot, it's false consciousness to believe in an absolute vision or meta-narrative or truth. In other words, postmodernism is less authoritative than modernism. It argues for multiple voices, multiple perspectives. Postmodernism is about diversity. There's a major emphasis on identity, difference. Where modernism is about faith in one answer, one project, one kind of way out of a problem, postmodernism argues there's no one answer. It's all about fragmentation, discontinuity, and even deconstruction. So if modernism is a period marked by answers, postmodernism is a historical condition that we still live in today, though some would argue it's coming to an end, is a period marked by questions. And we recognize there's no clean or simple answer to anything. So maybe we'll think about that as we begin to take some of the questions raised by, and I didn't really talk about the case study house so much, but it's not on your slide list and I don't really care. More I'm concerned with how we then begin to think about this more postmodernism more broadly and its impact. So in the last few slides that we're going to look at together today, we're going to discuss pop art particularly. And so again, all this is happening, you know, the Eames are practicing at the same time as Warhol and others that we're going to sort of talk about now, at the same time as people like Jackson Pollock, right? And it's all kind of dealing with that climate of post-World War II, of that increased questioning of the world around us, but also that increased affluence of a consumer population, right, and what that means. Okay, so pop art. And here I'm showing you the work of Richard Hamilton. Just what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing, from 1956? And you guys have probably heard about the term pop art before. And if you have, or popular-based art, and that, if you have, you may think of somebody like Warhol, and I'll show us an obligatory slide by him in a minute. But the term pop art really signals an international art movement. And it starts in Britain, particularly in London, in a group situated around the Institute of Contemporary Art. And this particular image you're looking at is a representation of a collage produced by Richard Hamilton to advertise a show of all of these artists. Now the term gets coined by a critic by the name of Lawrence Alloway in 1958, the term itself, pop art. But already we see that evident here in Richard Hamilton's work. So we see a work that has a popular subject matter. It's not like the angst of those abstract expressionist painters here. We recognize the subject very clearly. Well, we've seen collage already. We saw how Picasso or Braque brought in posters for concert halls or other things into their work, boxes from department stores. Here we see that popular kind of taken up an ante, or that incorporation of pop culture. So we see an image with kind of this bodybuilder type in the middle with a Tootsie Pop placed right at the level of the phallus, right? We see another figure over here, kind of female nude with a lampshade on her head, wearing kind of pasties on her breasts. On the coffee table, we see a canned ham. I mean, the canned ham comes out of the 1950s, right, or 1940s. We see the television over here with a beautiful woman looking out. We see a framed cartoon, a lampshade made out of a Ford car company insignia, a rug that looks an awful lot like Jackson Pollock painting, a staircase with a woman at the top vacuuming, the vacuum's down here, a little sign telling us ordinary cleaners reach only this far. Right? So it's kind of playing with the strategies and the language of corporate advertising as a parody. But it's a parody that has a kick to it. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that art historians have long debated whether pop art is celebratory of that pop culture or whether it's critical of that pop culture. You know, are pop artists critiquing their social moment in its absorption of mass culture? Or are they actually celebrating it? And in fact, the critic David Sylvester once commented about Richard Hamilton's work, quote, Hamilton never makes it clear how far he's being satirical, how far he is rather in love with the subject. And it's this equivocation that's of interest, unquote, right? So that it plays with that line. Okay, but it also demonstrates, in fact, that, you know, this pop art, and this emphasis on a recognizable subject matter becomes incredibly influential moving into the 1950s, late 50s and 60s, and that it's just as much about the subject matter of pop as it is about the actual technologies of advertising that get incorporated. So here we see collage and this kind of mixing, but if we think of somebody like Andy Warhol and his use of silkscreen, we actually see how he's using that advertising strategy of a silkscreen to kind of produce the work. But I'll get to that in a second. But Warhol, we're pretty much, I'm sure you've probably heard of before. I'm showing you a first view into one of his first exhibition in the Ferris Gallery in 1962 of the Campbell soup cans. These ones, just to be clear, were actually all hand painted. So these were not silk screened images, although by 1964, Warhol has completely gone to the silk screen as a mechanism for making his work. Here we have 32 paintings in a gallery because at the time there were 32 flavors of Campbell's soup, or types of Campbell's soup, and he painted each one. Now Warhol began his career as a commercial artist, continued to support himself through his commercial work until at least 1963, though some would argue even after that. But it also became the mechanism, that commercial art kind of world, the mechanism for which he actually defined his more fine art-based practice. In other words, he began his paintings with crude advertisements, sometimes ripping off comic strips or images from comic strips, other times demonstrating or showing images like you see here, just simple consumer products. And it's those that really propelled his career. All of his work is kind of dominated in the same way, very simple images, recognizable, connection to corporate capitalism. Sometimes those images are hand-painted, as we see here. More often they're silk-screened, as we see in the image on the right. Here we see Warhol and one of his studio assistants, Gerald Malenga, actually silk-screening what's going to look like a Brillo box. So again, completely ripping off the actual look of a consumer product, producing that, and then installing that in a gallery. On the left, you see Warhol on a couch in his studio. This was a particular manifestation of his studio, which there were 3 different manifestations of it. They were all called the factory. So, and I think that's important, it's not a studio, it's a factory, right? It's where corporate production or consumers' production happens. And that's a mechanism for how he sees his work, right? Or how he plays with a definition of art. It's not just produced in a kind of solitary studio, it's produced in a factory. By 1965, this image is most definitely staged, because by 1965, Warhol's doing very little of the silk screening himself. Mostly it's done by studio assistants, right? So he becomes that big, that fast, that he kind of gains a distance from it. These studios, and I should say, we're not going to talk about his studios, but the silver factory was just one manifestation which they put silver, aluminum foil, or aluminum paint around the whole factory. These factories were often sites of other kinds of activities too, like multimedia spectacles. It's where the band Velvet Underground first started in the studio. So these kinds of, in the factory rather, these kinds of performances would happen there. But there were also places where it was just kind of like a meet and greet of sort of fringe characters in the art world at the time. So kind of a place for them to kind of coagulate. Now, we will talk a little bit about silk screen and that notion of the silk screen, because it does have implications for this work. And we've talked about other kinds of printmaking before, but a silk screen is a process where you just use a screen as the kind of mechanism to which produce prints. And how you do it is you take some kind of photo sensitive material, you often coat the screen with it, you expose it to light using photostat or some other kind of mechanism to fix some of that photo emulsion to the surface and to allow for the light to kill away other parts of it. You then wash the screen. Some of that emulsion that you put on it comes off, some stays on. You then take ink and squeegee it past the screen, and wherever the emulsion is washed away, you can push screen through a fine, you can push pigment through a fine fabric screen that will then allow you to transfer the design. It's a really common practice for t-shirt design, but for other kinds of commercial design as well, posters, other things. It's interesting, again, because it's a technique of mass marketing, right? A technique of advertising brought into the studio, but it does have implications, particularly around notions of the originality of a work of art. So in other words, after 1964, almost no image is produced by Warhol that's not a silk screen. But you go into a museum and you look at a painting, we can maybe talk about either one of these. He's very well known for his images of Marilyn Monroe, which, although this is 1962, and which does explore silk screen here. They go up through the later part of the 1960s. Or we can talk about his 16 Jackies from 1965, 4 images repeated 4 times, 2 of which are from that famous Dallas motorcade in which JFK is assassinated. And right before he's assassinated, those pictures are taken from, and 2 of which are from his funeral, right? So just to kind of give us a sense of them. So we see this image in a contemporary art museum, right? We go look at it. Do you think that museum calls it a silkscreen, or do you think that museum calls it a painting? Any ideas? These works, although they're all silkscreens, almost every single institution calls them paintings. Anybody know why? Simple, guys. It sounds better, right? It sounds like there's one, not many. Doesn't sound like a mass marketing advertisement campaign, right? It sounds like you've created some kind of specialness around the object. Well, a museum is going to want to do that because they probably paid $50 million for that work, right? So they want to create specialness around it. They want to create a lot of specialness around it now. So this idea of these techniques of mass marketing create a kind of crisis for the art world of how do we make sense of this work? How do we combat any kind of loss of specialness, or what the cultural theorist Walter Benjamin in 1936 called the aura, the loss of aura around a work of art? How do we kind of make sense of that? I'm going to just show you one other artist working at the same time, producing images connected to corporate capitalism as well, or techniques. The techniques are connected. Here's the work of Lichtenstein, Roy Lichtenstein. The painting that I'm showing you here, Wham, from 1963, is 14 feet across, just to give you a sense of, again, it's like billboard size. Lichtenstein's images are largely based on heroic comic books of either World War II battles, which you see here, Wham. The text reads, "I press the fire control, and ahead of me, rockets blaze through the sky." We then see those rockets very much coming out of a plane that's marked as a U.S. plane, moving across the diptych. Note the line here, it's a 2-panel painting. Over here to blow up, presumably, an enemy ship with a big wham above it, right? Lichtenstein's looking at comic books, whether of World War II, of this heroicism, which were very popular in the 60s, or comic books that talked about other kinds of things, like romantic sentimentalism or relationships. And he began to paint those comic books as a mean, in a sense, to respond to that pop culture around him. He developed a technique as early as 1961, which would appropriate not just the subject matter of comic strips, but its style. And that's called the Ben-Day dot system. Ben-Day dots is a type of screen, halftone screening, which is used in commercial printing processes and was at that time, particularly for newspaper printing. And basically it works that there's little dots, so you use maybe 4 color dots to comprise the tonal variation of the image. But if you look very closely at a Ben-Day dot screen, you can see the tiny dots of color, right? It pulls apart. Lichtenstein actually paints with those tiny dots of color. He starts out in the early 60s literally painting each work by hand. As he then moves up, he uses stencils and other kind of mechanisms to create broader areas of tonal shade in his compositions. But this investment in comic strips was not just about entertainment for the artist. In fact, I think comics, I would argue, played a more important or active role in contemporary culture through the themes or storylines that they tell. And that's even true today. My kids are really interested in comic books. We live right by this comic book store. I'm always buying them for them because they're big, huge into like superheroes. But I edit them as I read. Why? Because there's all sorts of assumptions about gender relationships, about power relationships, about good guys, bad guys, villains, that are very stereotypical. And there's a market for that, right? So yes, so I'm molding those little minds in really perverse ways, right? But there's a reason for that, right? We look at comic books for clarity, in a sense, as a culture. And comic books really, they're around in the 1920s and 30s, but become incredibly popular right after World War II. And because we have disposable income to buy them, number one. But it's sort of like Law and Order, the ubiquitousness of Law and Order, and how many spin-offs there's been. We look to that kind of programming as a way to clarify certain kind of moral values, Very simple, right? Like as a culture, we do that. We don't even think about it, right? We like Law and Order because at the end, typically anyway, the good guy wins, the bad guy gets punished, right? Or we look at comic books to talk about simple societal divisions, explain them or reinforce them. Lichtenstein's playing with that, right? He's looking at things like good versus evil, war, or even kind of romantic sentimentalism and gender relations and hopeless here. That's the way it should have begun, but it's hopeless, right? You know, here our female protagonist is quite sentimental and quite, you know, pathetic, really. But it plays with that notion of self-worth that are very stereotypical at the time. Is Lichtenstein celebrating that or critiquing that? Well, he's probably doing a bit of both, right, as most of the pop artists were doing. So in today's class, we've talked about that post-World War II context. In particular, we've been thinking about how the rise of corporate capitalism, you know, questions around the difficulties of moving forward in culture after World War II, mid-century design practices, how that all kind of comes together to reinforce that corporate capitalist moment that we're talking about in this lecture on consumers, and particularly to reinforce things like that American dream. You know, I introduced the term postmodernism to all of you, but really postmodernism as a term, you know, it really starts to come into its own right around 1963 and into the latter part of the 60s. So in a sense, we see in this work the fragmentation or the ending of a kind of modernist culture that we've been talking about for a while. So I really think this lecture kind of helps us cap or end that discussion of modernism that we started with 4 classes ago. But in the next few minutes of class, so that's one thing. You know, we've done our little, run through the centuries on modernism. Okay, great. Or run through a 200-year period through modernism. Great. But what I want to do now is spend a few minutes kind of contextualizing the class as a whole. Because today is our last class together, at least for the purposes of a lecture. We will all meet next class for your final exam. You must come to the time that you're scheduled for that exam, just to kind of keep that in mind. But I want to at least say a few words about how this course comes together and maybe make sense of it for you as you move forward. Because although, I'm sure you've learned particular material week to week and you've studied that, you've put it in your brain, I think the chances of any of that really sticking 5 years from now are dubious, right? Like you probably won't remember this painting, or if you do, you probably won't remember exactly what I said about it. And I think that's fine. The issue of a course like this is really to set into place certain kinds of structures or tools for thinking about representation. That's all we've done all year, right? So we started all the way back in September talking about prehistoric culture, 15,000 BCE, right? We've then charted our way through in a very fragmented, discontinuous way through time to the postmodern period where we're going to end today. The view into cultural production that I have shown you is only ever partial and fragmented. You are unfortunately having a view of history taught by a Western art historian predominantly, right? So I haven't given you much view of global cultures or of, unfortunately for you, I study mostly fine art, so you've had probably way too much of it for your desires. But, really my theory, and I think it's a pretty good one, so I'm going to promote it and argue for it, is that it doesn't really matter what you go on to do next, whether you're going to make paintings or objects or industrial designed objects or animated films. What we've done in this class is really gotten you to think critically and contextually about representation as a practice. What does it mean to make images, objects, and what does it mean to take responsibility for the legacy of those images and objects? Again, it doesn't matter any particular object that we've had in this course. I mean, again, you need to remember it for next week, but after that, I don't really care. What I care is that you have learned tools to ask questions around an object, around an image, around even a thought that you might have for producing that object and image. Again, whatever its requirements or whatever its media. And so, we've talked about the importance of asking those kinds of questions around who, what, where, how, as a means to understand context. Images circulate in context, regardless of what they do. And those contexts have implications. I mean, obviously I'm a historian, I believe in the importance of history, but I don't believe in it because I really care about the past. I care about now. I study history to give me a view into today. And so the kinds of tools and questions and vocabulary that we've been building up in this course is meant to do a couple of things for you. First of all, it's meant to give you a grounding. How do you talk about representation in an institution like this? Right? Obviously, I have talked about it in very political and specific ways because those are my interests. But there's 350 people in this class, and I would assume you all have different interests, and you may have liked some of the ways I talked about them, you may have not liked some of the ways I talked about them. That's totally cool. The issue is to understand that as makers, you have a responsibility in that process. You need to think about your context, the context that matters to you. And you need to know how to ask the questions in order to make those images, objects, films, whatever else, and to ensure that they function in the way you want them to function. It's all about knowledge so that you can be more historical knowledge as a way to understand your practice today and what you want your practice to be for you. So this class has taken us through all sorts of places, all sorts of material. I mean, it's mind-numbing to go back and think about it all, right? But I think the real purpose is to provide a grounding for asking the questions necessary for contextualizing your own work. And you may not feel that's as important, this class isn't as important if you're I often get like illustration students or animation students saying, well, we should saw more illustration or more animation. Well, yeah, I wish you did too. That's not my specialty, I'm sorry. But I really don't care what we looked at. You learned how to look at an object. You learned how to look and ask questions about representation that are equally valid. And if I believe nothing else from this class, I believe passionately that the more mindful and critical you are in how you do that for you, the better your practice will be, the more successful it will be in however you want to define success. So thanks very much for a great class, everyone. I'll see you next week.